Thank you so much, Mary, for this very exciting opportunity to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Sophie Chao, for the Friday Forum. Dr. Chao is currently a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Sydney's School of Philosophical and Historical Inquiry. As an environmental anthropologist, her research focuses on the intersections of capitalism, ecology, and indigeneity in the Pacific, wherein she is particularly interested in exploring the changing relationships between plants and people across Indigenous corporate and scientific contexts. Her PhD thesis, In the Shadow of the Palms, Plant-Human Relations Amongst the Marine West Papua, currently a manuscript under contract with Duke University Press, received the Macquarie University Vice Chancellor's Commendation, the Australian Anthropological Society PhD Thesis Prize, and the Asian Studies Association of Australia John Ledge Prize for the Best Thesis in Asian Studies. Dr. Chao has published numerous journal articles and book chapters. You can find a very comprehensive list of all those on her website, modernhumanworlds.com. I'll make sure to drop the link in the chat, and I highly recommend you visit it. And she is currently secretary on the executive committee of the Australian Anthropological Society, a co-convener of the Australian Food Society and Culture Network, a co-convener of the Biopolitics of Science Research Network, and a co-convener of the Higher Degree Research Multi-Species Justice Reading Group. Most recently, I had the great pleasure of collaborating with Dr. Chao on a panel for the upcoming annual meeting of the AAS, namely Plantations in Southeast Asia, which I highly recommend exploring to all those of you who are interested in the topic or and are registered to attend the meeting. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Sophie Chao to speak today about eaten and being eaten, the meaning of hunger in West Papua.
Thank you so much to the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and particularly to Ida for inviting me to present, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm speaking to you today from the unceded lands of the Darumuragal people of the Darug Nation, and I want to start by paying my respects to these traditional custodians. I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands upon which my current institution is built, the University of Sydney, and I want to acknowledge their denied sovereignties to lands and territories. So as Ida outlined, the paper I want to give today very much draws from my long-term ethnographic fieldwork in the Indonesian-controlled region of West Papua, where I've been exploring how one particular indigenous community, the Marind, experience, conceptualize, and contest the adverse social and environmental impacts of large-scale deforestation and monocrop oil palm expansion. In the paper I'm giving today, I want to focus particularly on how Indigenous Marind experience and conceptualize the condition of hunger in the context of growing local food insecurity and malnutrition in Merauke, where I was doing my research, both of which have been provoked in large part by the radical landscape transformations that Donna Haraway and others have characterized as the Plantationocene. So we're traveling together today to the villages of Ralayam, Mirav, and Bayau that are located along the upper reaches of the Bian River in the district of Merauke, which is itself located in the Indonesian-controlled region of West Papua, down on the southern and easternmost corner where the bright red dot is on the map here. In May 2016, I was invited to share a meal with the family of Barnabas Diken, a Marind village elder in the Upper Bian village of Ralayam. A group of women prepared the food in the outdoor kitchen whilst Barnabas and I chatted on the porch. The centerpiece of this meal was a cut of deer hunted by Barnabas and his kin. With the neighboring forests rapidly giving way to monocrop oil palm plantations, game around Ralayam village had become increasingly rare in the last few years. Many of the children in the villages had never tasted it, and Barnabas himself hadn't consumed it in over 2 months. Once an everyday foodstuff, meat was now a rare privilege and one offered only to the most honored of guests. As soon as the woman started to cook the meat, a pungent smell filled the courtyard. The longer the meat stewed, the stronger the smell became. The gelatinous chunks broke into shreds. The soup turned milky, and the sickly sweet steam made our eyes sting. The meat, I realized, was thoroughly rotten. In between shallow breaths, my companions and I swallowed with difficulty the sticky, grey, viscous flesh presented to us by the woman. After a while, my friends bowed their heads and began to sob quietly. They told me they were sobbing from anger and from pain. Barnabus's wife, Evelina, murmured, "In the past, Marind had plenty of meat and sago. The forest was full of food and hunger was rare. Now oil palm eats our land. The road eats our people. The city eats our children. Now Marind eat rice and instant noodles. Our skin is dry and our bodies weak. Some of us eat our own kin. Since oil palm arrived, everyone in the villages is hungry. This hunger never goes away. For some to be fed, others must go hungry." Now, over the last decade, the inhabitants of Khalayam village, including Evelina and Barnabus, and also inhabitants of neighboring settlements along the Upper Bian River, have seen vast swaths of their customary lands and forests targeted for a 2 million hectare agribusiness scheme promoted by the Indonesian government to achieve national food sovereignty and to support the world's growing food and fuel needs. Known as the Merauke Integrated Food and Energy Estate, or MIFE, this mega project was initiated in 2008 by then President Yudhoyono and declared a national priority by current President Jokowi in 2015. At the time of writing, oil palm plantations promoted under MIFE covered some 1.2 million hectares in Merauke district and over 20% of the Upper Bian area, with many more companies currently seeking permits for cash crop mining and timber concessions. This image here is a piece of drone footage that I captured during my fieldwork in the Upper Bian. By June 2019, when I last visited Khalayam, some 75,000 hectares had been converted to plantations without villagers' free, prior, or informed consent. Only a few patches of forest and sago groves were left standing. Deprived of the lands where they once hunted and foraged, villagers relied increasingly on government-subsidized rice and imported instant noodles, purchased with compensation payments or distributed under corporate social welfare programs. According to data I obtained from the Timase Township Clinic, over 130 infants had died from malnourishment, dysentery, and food poisoning in the preceding year. The heightened food insecurity faced by Marind had at the time already been raised in several complaints to the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, and the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But these complaints remained largely unaddressed by the Indonesian government. Meanwhile, many villagers told me they had forgotten the taste of game once abundant around their settlements: deer, cassowary, and boar, amongst others. Marind were afflicted with unprecedented forms of hunger, hungers my companions repeatedly told me that never go away. In this primarily ethnographic paper, I want to begin by exploring how Marind understand the etiology and morality of hunger in the context of traditionally valued forest foods, food environments, and food procurement practices. I'll then describe how monocrop expansion and commodified foodways are giving rise to new, different, and conflictual forms of hunger amongst Marind: hunger for sago, hunger for modern foods, hunger for money, and hunger for the flesh of Marind's own kin. These new hungers are compounded by the subjection of Marind themselves to the seemingly insatiable appetite of an array of invasive, destructive, and mutually colluding entities: the government and corporations, roads, cities, and oil palm. I'll then examine how Marind rationalize the prevalence of hunger in light of pre-existing beliefs in ancestral retribution, the settler colonial history of West Papua, millenarian notions of martyrdom, and the sacrificial logic of capitalist modernity, one that, as Evelina had put it, requires that some go hungry for others to be fed. Drawing from Marind discourses and practices, I want to argue in this paper that hunger for Marind constitutes an ontologically plural and symbolically laden experiential mode whose political and phenomenological significance transcends the parameters of nutritional intake and food accessibility, and whose subjects and objects encompass differently situated, yet ultimately interconnected human and other than human entities. My aim in this paper is not to underplay the widespread food insecurity and malnutrition faced by Marind today, nor to idealize their traditional forest-based diet. Rather, I'm interested in the culturally shaped ways in which Marind harness the experience, morality, and hermeneutics of hunger to comment and critique on broader changes taking place in their everyday lives amidst ongoing political colonization, ethnic domination, and ecological degradation. In doing so, I'm trying to contribute through this paper to a growing body of scholarship that is pushing against the presumed universality of hunger and investigating instead its socioculturally modulated manifestations and meanings. I want to offer a complement to nutritional anthropological studies that tend to privilege quantitative measurements of nutritional intake and calorific expenditure over the more moral and symbolically laden significance of food deficiency from emic perspectives. And I also want to inform, through this paper, macro-level political economy approaches to food insecurity by, again, exploring hunger as an intersubjective, lived experience of debated etiologies and effects. In particular, I'd like to invite interdisciplinary dialogue through the materials I present between, on the one hand, anthropological studies of food and culture focused on human diet and nutrition, and on the other hand, more than human approaches to the intersections of health and environment that are being developed in fields of new materialisms, multi-species studies, and the environmental humanities. As I'll try to show, amongst Marind, hunger is a human experience, but it is also an attribute of cash crops, material infrastructures, state and corporate actors, and diffuse regimes of global capitalist power. The meaning and morality of hunger vary depending as much on what is eaten as who is eating. Far from singular or definite, the causality of hunger too multiplies along cultural, political, and more than human lines. So let me turn first to Marind's forest foodways. Papuan Marind traditionally derive their subsistence from hunting, fishing, and gathering in the forest. Sago groves provide Marind with their staple starch food, sago flour, which is extracted and processed manually from the trunk of pre-inflorescent palms. Carbohydrates obtained from sago flour are supplemented with tubers and roots, mainly taro and yam, while protein is obtained from riverine fish, sago grubs, and forest game, including deer, possums, cassowaries, kangaroos, crocodiles, and wild pigs. Fruit, including mangoes, rambutans, bananas, and jackfruit, are also found in the forest alongside leaves, barks, resins, and saps that are used to make medicinal concoctions. Forest foods are gathered by Marind during collective expeditions that take place approximately every 2 months and that last from a couple of weeks to over a month. Participants in these food expeditions range from 8 to over 30 individuals, and they include both nuclear family members and members of extended families and clans. The division of labor during these foraging expeditions is very much inflected along gendered and generational lines, with men primarily responsible for hunting game, women with sago processing and cooking, and elders with transmitting forest knowledge to children and to adolescents, such as, for instance, the genesis story of forest organisms, their ancestral relationship to Marind clans, the ecosystems in which they flourish, and the rituals performed when these species are procured, prepared, and eventually consumed. Forest foodways are widely associated by Marind with the condition of satiety or kekenyangan. Satiety, which manifests physically in the form of glossy skins and wet bodies, and emotionally in the form of serenity and good humor, arises primarily from the intimate relationships that Marind entertain with the plants and animals from whom forest foods derive. Described by Marind as grandparents or siblings, these forest organisms share common descent with Marind clans from ancestral spirits, or dema. They are organisms that are considered to be sentient and agentive, and therefore not amenable to domestication, a practice which many Marind describe as a form of violence that deprives forest species of their freedom and autonomy. Procuring and consuming forest foods in the natural environment involves an array of ritual codes that communicate respect for and a celebration of ancestral interspecies kinships. And forest foods are said to be most satiating when eaten in the forest itself, where attentive listening and observation of one's lively surrounds enhances the flavor of the foods consumed. Satiety or kekenyangan also transcends the human realm in that it encompasses the nourishment that Marind themselves provide for their other than human kin. For instance, the sweat of community members sustains the growth of vegetation when it comes into contact with branches, leaves, and twigs as people walk the forest, whilst human blood becomes fodder for hematophagous critters such as leeches and mosquitoes. Hunters intentionally leave fruit, nuts, and sago flour at the site where they capture their game in exchange for the life of the animal taken. A portion equivalent to an adult male's intake is always left behind for forest animals and usually left atop a mound of soil or wrapped in layered banana leaves. Marind continue to nourish their other than human kin after their death when their bodies are buried in the forest and decompose to feed the soil, its plants, fungi, and insects, as well as the mammals, reptiles, and birds that then prey upon these organisms. Far from a human prerogative alone, nourishment then arises from the ability of every single organism within the forest ecology to inhabit and to shift across multiple and interlinked subjectivities, as feeder, as fed, and as food. Now, if the forest is a realm of nourishment, it is also a place of hunger. In this environment, the availability of different foods is shaped by seasonal variation, species migration and reproduction patterns, and periodic droughts and monsoons. The rise and fall in availability of different foods that accompanies these changes constitute part of an extensive body of ecological knowledge that Marind called ilmu hutan, or forest knowledge. Extended periods of hunger in the forest occurred only sporadically, and these were interpreted by Marind as ancestral retribution against those in the village who had disrespected or over-depleted the forest's plant and animal resources, by, for instance, killing juvenile or gestating animals, felling palms and vegetation prematurely, and failing to perform rituals towards species hunted or foraged. Food restrictions, too, are often explained by Marind as expressions of respect towards plants and animals. Holding off from consuming certain species during their periods of gestation or mating, and accepting the hunger that accompanies these taboos, testifies to people's capacity to make restrained use of forest resources, and in so doing, to avoid the detrimental consequences of resource depletion on both themselves and on their kindred plants and animals. Hungers in the forest are also subject to divergent moral evaluations. So, for instance, the hungers provoked by walking the forest, foraging and hunting for extensive periods, caring for children and elders, or processing sago starch are said to be good hungers. Akin to the notion of appetite, these hungers are positively valued because they demonstrate that one has invested one's energies and time in procuring food and caring for one's kin. They are hungers generated by and sustained through iterative social interaction and collective labor. These hungers are openly spoken about and celebrated, both by those who experience them and by those who help to satiate them through food procurement and gifting. Other kinds of hunger in the forest, meanwhile, are negatively assessed and serve as social sanctions that enhance patterns of sociality and reciprocity. So, for instance, an individual or group that goes hungry because no one shares food with them suggests that they have done something to cause displeasure to fellow villagers. And indeed, withholding food constitutes an important means through which Marind communicate their disapproval of other people's behaviors, individuals who must then in turn reflect on the cause of this withholding and find ways to remedy the underlying conflict or dispute. Unlike good hungers, punitive hungers are rarely spoken about in public, and rather they are subject to widespread private gossip behind closed doors by those who witness them. The lack of hunger and constant hunger, meanwhile, are both interpreted as signs of illness, as symptoms of a sorcery attack, or sometimes both at once. The morality of good and bad hungers in turn shapes food etiquette in daily life. So, for instance, refusing food on account of not being hungry is deemed a great insult to those who have prepared or procured the food offered. Conversely, consuming food ravenously is also disapproved of as selfish and inconsiderate, as is indeed eating alone or in private, or failing to share one's food with those one is on good terms with. Learning to eat at an acceptable pace and with due regard for others' share constitutes a central part of children's enculturation into Marind society. Equally important here is the need for children to learn to hunger for different kinds of forest foods, rather than any single one amongst them. An imbalance in food hungered after and consumed is considered dangerous, as it will undermine the overall strength and growth of the child and predispose it to illness and injury. So what counts as good or bad hunger amongst Marind is highly relative and contextual. Defined at once by its subject and its object, what hunger means depends not just on what food is desired, but also on who experiences and satiates hunger, where, when, and why. In this regard, then, hunger is not simply a biophysical condition defined by the absence or lack of food defined in generic terms. Rather, hunger is a profoundly moral condition of being, one that communicates something important about the individual's social standing and their relationship to other individuals within the community, as well as to the sentient forest ecology in, with, and from which nourishment is achieved. Over the last decade, the expansion of monocrops in Merauke, compounded with attendant processes of deforestation, land privatization, infrastructural development, settler in-migration, and commodified foodways, have given rise to new and different forms of hunger amongst Upper Bian Marind. As we smoked clove cigarettes on the porch after our fateful meal of rotten meat, Barnabas explained these new and different hungers to me as follows. In the past, he said, Marind hungered for sago when the rains refused to fall or Dema were angry. But then the rains would fall, Dema would be appeased, and the forest would bear food. Today, Marind are hungry for all kinds of things. These hungers are foreign and different. Today, some Marind hunger for sago and others for money. Some Marind hunger for plastic foods and others for the flesh of their own kin. Before, hunger for forest foods united us. Now, new and different kinds of hunger divide us. The transformations narrated by Barnabas sit within a longer history of growing food insecurity in the Upper Bian region. Hunger, Barnabas explained, became prevalent during the Dutch colonial period, when Marind's access to the foods of the forest was constrained by enforced sedentarization, the abolishment of clan and village-wide ritual feasts, and the promotion of introduced cash crops, such as rice, maize, and peanuts. The photo on this slide here is a reenactment of one of these ritual feasts that previously occurred across the Upper Bian. Hunger, Barnabas continued, increased after the forced incorporation of West Papua into Indonesia in 1969, which was accompanied by large-scale rice cultivation, oil palm developments, and mining and logging projects. 4 new and often awkwardly coexistent forms of hunger have accompanied the transformation of Marind ecologies and diets over the past century, and particularly in the last 10 years with the expansion of oil palm plantations. Whilst divergent in their respective objects, these 4 hungers are all said to adversely affect individuals' bodily and behavioral dispositions. People's skin, for instance, are said to have become parched, pale, and rough, their limbs thin, their bones brittle, and their ability to participate in social activities limited by a generalized weakness and lethargy. The bodily and behavioral changes caused by new hungers are also said to be contagious to others, who begin to feel their own bodies weaken, their concentration fail, and their desire to interact, walk the forest, and forage together decrease. As Barnabas' wife Evelina explained, when people feel the hunger of others, it makes them lose their energy. Hunger is like an illness. Even if you have eaten, you lose your strength when you see others without food because you can feel their pain. One person's hunger makes everyone feel hungry. This is a new and different kind of hunger. The first of these new and different hungers is the hunger for forest-derived foods that have become increasingly rare as a result of deforestation and agribusiness development. Known locally as hunger for sago, sago being a term that is often used synecdochally with forest foods, hunger arises here from the material and spiritual severance of Marind, from intimate relations of feeding and being fed that they once entertained with their other-than-human forest king. The hunger for sago, I was told, is one that grips the gut and weakens the leg. It causes anger and grief amongst those who are no longer able to walk the forest, encounter plants and animals, or recount their lively stories and pasts. Hunger for sago also arises from Marind's increasing inability to nourish their forest companions through ritual and practical forms of exchange, distribution, and gifting. Instead, native organisms struggle to survive as groves, swamps, and grasslands give way to monocrops, where little food is to be found, and animals are vulnerable to chemical pesticides, illegal poaching, and introduced predator species. Hunger for sago then speaks to Marind's sense of a loss of identity, rootedness, and belonging as they find themselves excluded from the more than human world they are sustained by and sustain. In the process, intergenerationally transmitted and valued forms of knowledge are vanishing, along with the pride and self-worth of those entrusted to pass them on through their words and deeds, the hunting skills of men, the sago processing techniques of women, and the oral craftsmanship of elders. Eroded too in the wake of deforestation is Marind's sense of connection to other ethnic groups across Papua and Melanesia, whose affinities arise from a shared cultural, ecological, and alimentary ethos as sago people. As the forest diminishes, Marind have become increasingly reliant on imported commodities such as instant noodles, biscuits, and rice, which now compose over 4/5 of their daily nutritional intake. While some villagers hunger for sago, others are developing an appetite for these imported foreign communities, or what Marind call a hunger for plastic foods. Plastic, Barnabas explained to me, refers to things, practices, persons, and places that are associated with modernity and that are characterized by their uncontrolled proliferation and their deceptive allure. For instance, whilst forest foods are disappearing, carton after carton of rice, noodles, and biscuits are flooding the villages. These commodities arrive enclosed in shiny plastic wrappings, but they are never satiating. Unlike the nourishing and diverse foods of the grove, their origins and producers are deemed to be foreign, distant, and unknown. The variety of these foods is highly limited, and their consumption is usually restricted to the space of the village rather than the forest. And it is these attributes of plastic foods that are often invoked by Marind in explaining why imported commodities taste dry, bland, and unpalatable. Plastic foods, as Maria, a young girl from Khalayan, put it, are not nourishing because they do not taste of the land. Plastic foods are not only said to fail to provide satiation, they are also said to intensify the hunger of those who consume them. For instance, children who regularly eat instant noodles clamor for more food within a mere few hours. Some villagers describe to me their growing craving for processed biscuits, which they snack on throughout the day without ever feeling full. Young men in the village reported having become addicted to rice, fizzy drinks, and canned meats, which they would consume in large amounts, but without ever achieving the satisfaction of satiation. As Pius, one such young man, described, when you eat sago, you can go without food for an entire day. But when you eat plastic foods, you become even more hungry. The more you eat, the more you want to eat. This is a hunger that never goes away. The gustatory subversions wrought by the introduction of plastic foods works in close conjunction with the emergence of what Marind called hunger for money. Now, this hunger is said to be an attribute of individuals in the village who have accepted compensation payments from corporations or who have sought employment on plantations as harvesters and pesticide sprayers. People who hunger for money, I was told, tend to keep money for their own enjoyment rather than share it with their kin. They spend this money on items or activities that are deemed wasteful, selfish, or immoral. Some, for instance, spend their money on fridges and televisions, even though there is no signal or electricity in the village. Others purchase alcohol illegally from the village kiosk or in Merauke City and become dangerously violent towards fellow community members when they return inebriated. Never satisfied with what they consume, those who eat money seek pleasure in things and places that, very much like plastic foods, exacerbate rather than satiate their desire, whilst also undermining the material and moral well-being of the broader community. As Miranda, a young woman from Baya village, put it, these people, the ones who hunger for money, their hands stink of dollar bills and alcohol, but their wives and children go hungry. Their hunger destroys them and everyone around them. Their hunger eats them up. The hunger for money and for plastic are in turn associated with a fourth, more sinister type of appetite, a hunger for the flesh of fellow Marind. This hunger for human flesh speaks in both symbolic and visceral ways to the detrimental effects of individualistic behavior on the bodies, nourishment, and future of Marind and their other than human kin. As Barre was described to me, the benefits and wealth promised by oil palm corporations have increasingly divided Marind clans, once united through kinship and custom. Co-optation, collusion, and conflict over matters of land rights and compensation have bred growing distrust in and across Marind villages. Once bound through their shared experiences of eating in and from the forest, villagers are now increasingly pitted against each other over cash and contracts. Marind individuals who participate in or collude with the oil palm sector, either through their land surrenders or through their labor, are often said to indirectly endorse the destruction of the forest that once sustained them. In doing so, they further undermine the access to forest foods of their human and more than human kin, and are themselves consumed by their incessant hunger for cash and commodities. The repercussions of this concomitantly self and other destroying cycle extends across species and across generations. And unlike the reciprocal and morally valued forms of consumption that characterize forest foodways, the hunger for flesh and for money together entail a destructive and unidirectional form of consumption, one in which people symbolically feed off each other to the detriment of both parties and to that of the nourishing forest ecologies obliterated by industrial plantations. As Darius, a village elder from Bayau, put it, before oil palm, Marind ate together from the forest. Now Marind eat each other up. But the hungers experienced by Marind are only one part of this story. The diverse, new and different hungers they are experiencing are exacerbated by their own subjection to the rapacious hunger of multiple, intrusive, and interconnected entities, some institutional, others infrastructural, and yet others vegetal. This second and coexistent grammar of hunger that I want to explore now very much remains anchored still in a relational understanding of hunger as a relation of eating and being eaten that operates both within and beyond the human category. However, the hungers of foreign others differ in their failure of reciprocity. Here, the positionality of the eater and the eaten is not reversible or exchangeable, but rather bounded and fixed. Echoing the immoral valences of hunger for money, plastic food, and kin described previously, the hungers of foreign others are insatiable, destructive, and corrosive. The subjects of these hungers may differ, but all of them operate in conjunction with one another, and their object is what remains constant, namely the bodies, lands, and futures of Marind and of their other than human environments. Roads are one of the many hungry entities haunting the Marind landscape today. Roads multiply by devouring the forest and eroding the soils upon and from which they are built. Their voracious appetite, Marind explained, manifests as roads tear across the landscape in ever more numerous capillaries of dust, fumes, and asphalt. Roads devour the trees and vegetation lying in their way, reducing them to unrecognizable rubble and charred remains. Roads also hunger after forest-dwelling animals whose lives, movements, and futures they obliterate, making it harder for Marind in turn to procure them for their own subsistence. In tandem, roads are said to prey upon the bodies of travelers, taking them far away from their villages and native lands. In so doing, roads are said to subvert and rupture the socialities that bind families and clans to one another. On the road, villagers are exposed to foreign persons in the form of military troops, non-Papuan settlers, and corporate representatives, amongst others. When prolonged or frequent, such encounters erode people's identities by making them forget their Papuan roots and culture, their native dialects, their forest foodways, and their ancestral ties to the nourishing forest environment. In its most tangible form, the hunger of roads causes people who travel along them to be eaten up completely. These individuals initially leave the village for short periods of time, but never return to their villages. No one knows if they have been waylaid, who they have encountered, whether they have had an accident, become lost, or died. The mystery surrounding these disappeared beings further testifies to the consuming power of the road itself over the bodies and fates of those who encounter and who use them. The hunger of roads works in conjunction with the hunger of another material infrastructure, the city. For Upper Biak Marind, the city here refers primarily to Merauke City, the capital of Merauke district, the closest urban center to their villages, and the city that most villagers have frequented at least once in their lives. Merauke City is home to major administrative institutions and public services, including the district's only fully equipped hospital, university, and airport. But the city is also a place that is said to eat Marind's pride, money, and health. For instance, many Marind who had visited Merauke City described feeling vulnerable, afraid, and shrunken because they did not comprehend how cities work and how city people behave. Some spoke of their embarrassment when trying to cross roads, when not understanding the traffic light system. Others spoke of feeling ignorant when asking passers-by for directions because they were unfamiliar with street names. The irrelevance of Marind's forest knowledge in this built environment is further exacerbated by the city's demography, which is overwhelmingly dominated by non-Papuan settlers of Malay origin, and from whom, incidentally, many Marind have suffered racial slurs, including dog, monkey, and pig. In the city, Marind must rely on money to survive, which they possess little of, and whose value they do not entirely know, such that they are often duped into overpaying for public transport, meals, or hotel rooms. For these and other reasons, Marind often spoke of feeling out of place and uncouth in the city because it erodes their dignity as Sago people and forest people, undermines their self-esteem as Papuans, and exposes them to geographies, people, and practices both alien and threatening. People who spend extended periods of time in the city begin to develop a hunger for plastic foods and money as they forget concomitantly the flavors of sago and game. In the city, people are vulnerable to illnesses that consume their bodies and those of their kin. Most prominent amongst these is HIV/AIDS, a prevalent disease in Merauke district and West Papua more generally that many Marind men have contracted from their encounters with non-Papuan prostitutes, and a condition that is said to eat their flesh and fluids until they gradually waste away into skin and bones. The symbolic consumption of bodies in the city takes sinister form also for Marind women who are vulnerable to being eaten, here meaning sexually harassed or abused, by city dwellers when traveling on their own, at night, or amongst groups of inebriated men. The city's uncontrolled sexual appetite, in turn, produces shame in those who have experienced its visceral violence. As Pia, a young woman from Bayau village, explained, in the city, hungry men want to eat our bodies. After men have eaten our bodies, then shame eats our bodies. The city is a hungry, dangerous place for women. Cities and roads, in turn, constitute the point of origin and entrance for other hungry and foreign beings into the Marind life world, notably representatives of the Indonesian government and agribusiness corporations. Both the state and corporations operate in conjunction with one another in terms of decision-making processes, land development decisions, and infrastructural projects. For instance, government representatives allocate to corporations the permits required to establish oil palm concessions, and many are shareholders in these same companies. Government agencies and corporations also often visit Marind villages in joint parties, such as the one featured on this photograph here, to promote agribusiness projects and to distribute compensation or social welfare packages. The frequent use of state, military, and police forces by corporations to guard their concessions is further invoked by many Marind as evidence that the government and the private sector are in fact one and the same thing. State corporate hunger for natural resources manifests in their relentless and shared pursuit of land for the development of ever-increasing agro-industrial plantations, both in terms of numbers and in terms of scale. Matters such as community consent, transparent consultation, and adequate compensation take secondary or negligible importance in the face of this hunger and are further undermined by the paucity of legal frameworks recognizing the rights of Indigenous Papuans to their territories. State corporate hunger for land, in turn, feeds their hunger for profit, which justifies further forms of dispossession and exploitation, underpaying casual workers, offering derisory compensation for land surrendered, and refusing to invest in adequate protective gear for plantation laborers, whose flesh and lungs are in turn again consumed by toxic chemicals and pesticides. The hunger of the government in particular takes on potent political hues in light of West Papua's forceful incorporation into the Indonesian nation, a form of control through symbolic ingestion that many of my companions invoke in describing their country as having been eaten by the state. As Evelina, for instance, explained, when Indonesia took over, they forced us into a land that is not ours. They ate our futures, they ate our autonomy, and they ate our freedom. Alongside the institutional and infrastructural forces consuming Marind bodies and futures sits another hungry being of vegetal form, oil palm. Introduced in the late 2000s, this plant and cash crop is spreading rapidly across Marind territories in the guise of large-scale plantations. Its proliferation operates in conjunction with the other hungry entities described so far, from the government and corporations benefiting from agribusiness development to the roads connecting plantations to Merauke city and other urban centers. Oil palm is widely characterized by Marind as a person of sorts, much like their forest, plant, and animal kin. In this sense, many Marind talk about all palm as a plant that is also endowed with its own particular affordances, desires, and agencies. But unlike native forest species, all palm is widely characterized by Marind as a selfish, greedy, and immoral being. All palm, I was told, eats the forests raised to make way for its proliferation. It depletes the soil of its nutrients and minerals, and it saps the rivers diverted to irrigate the plantations. All palm also is said to eat time by erasing through its monocultural growth the polytemporal movements and propagation of diverse forest organisms, along with the more than human pasts inscribed in the forest landscape. The cash crop has exacerbated land loss and food insecurity for Marind, but ironically, of course, it feeds national and international communities of consumers in faraway places who, much like all palm, do not partake in local and reciprocal relations of eating and being eaten within the locale of Merauke and the Upper Bian. Finally, the hunger of all palm also transcends the realm of the waking world in its oniric manifestations. Dreams of being eaten by all palm have become increasingly prevalent amongst Marind since the cash crop's introduction. These harrowing nocturnal experiences entail the violent possession of sleepers by all palm in their sleep and result in sudden and uncontrollable onsets of malaria, dengue fever, migraines, as well as appetite loss once they awake. Those eaten by all palm in their sleep are also said to become increasingly taciturn and unwilling to participate in social activities such as sharing food, hunting, and processing sago. Their flesh dries out and their skin becomes dull. Across both waking and sleeping worlds, then, all palm's hunger depletes the energies and bodies of those whom it consumes, eating away at the landscape to nourish places and persons far removed from the forests and beings obliterated in its wake. I want to move on finally to the etiologies of hunger. Just as important to Marind as the what of hunger is its why. Indeed, the causes for hunger's intensification are as widely deliberated as its typologies and effects amongst Upper Bian villagers, who resort to an array of different knowledge systems in explaining hunger's prevalence. These explanatory models for hunger matter because they offer avenues for Marind to understand and potentially overcome the growing food insecurity that they face today. But at the same time, these explanations are the object of profound contestation, depending upon who or what they ascribe responsibility or blame to. While some of these etiologies foreground hunger as symptomatic of Marind's subjection to political and economic forces beyond their control, other etiologies frame hunger as a potentially desired and desirable condition, one that, for all its violence and injustice, is perhaps intrinsic to everyday life in a modern capitalist world. Let me begin with the first of these etiologies. Some amongst my interlocutors interpret hunger as a collective punishment meted upon Marind by ancestral spirits, or Dema. As the creators of all living and elemental forms, Dema, or ancestral spirits, demand respect and reverence from the Marind clans that they birthed at the beginning of time. These powerful spirits can reward Marind for their good deeds, but they can also injure or kill them if they violate customary law and if they undermine the well-being of their plant and animal siblings. At the beginning of the 20th century, for instance, Dema were said to have punished Marind for depleting bird of paradise populations to supply the European plume trade and consequently inflicted upon them a protracted famine. 10 years later, Marind's abandonment of cult activities under Dutch rule led to ancestral retribution in the form of devastating influenza and lymphogranuloma venereum epidemics. Agribusiness expansion in the last decade has driven a growing number of Marind to seek employment in the palm oil sector in the interests of a better income, education, and heightened social mobility. Many among these villagers have also surrendered their customary lands in exchange for monetary compensation. As a result, hunting, fishing, and gathering, together with the rituals of reverence towards Dema that these practices entail, are diminishing as forests are privatized and game and vegetation becoming scarce. The soil dies, the waters dry up. Rather than protecting their other than human kin, Marind who comply more or less willingly with the agendas of state and corporate actors partake in the obliteration of the forest and its diverse sentient beings. In doing so, they contravene the collective, more than human ethos of forest lifeways in favor for individualistic and materialistic gain. In doing so, villagers are triggering a profound societal and cosmological breakdown between the environment, the people, and the ancestors, which in turn is said to incur punitive action by the ancestral spirits in the form of a generalized hunger. A second etiology locates hunger in the context of West Papua's violent and volatile political history. Proponents of this explanatory model frame contemporary forms of hunger, both Marind's own and those of others, as the latest manifestation of the systemic discrimination, injustice, and oppression faced by Papuans under Indonesian rule, or what has come to be known locally as memoria passionis, a history of collective suffering. Oppression in this collective history takes the form of violated freedoms of expression, bureaucratic corruption, land expropriation, and legal frameworks that fail in practice to recognize people's rights to land and territories. Symptomatic of the racialized structural violence that has plagued the region since 1969, hunger conjures for many Marind the disposability and killability of Papuan bodies, cultures, and ecosystems in the eyes of the state, and also in the eyes of the foreign nations who remain apathetic to Papuan struggle for self-determination. For some Marind, hunger further testifies to a slow-motion genocide in West Papua, one perpetuated through population dilution, cultural erosion, criminalization, and incarceration, and the killing of human rights activists. From this perspective, then, hunger reveals itself less a radical rupture than a continuation of and commentary on settler colonial injustices and attendant forms of systemic dispossession, displacement, and disempowerment. A third and particularly contentious explanatory model articulates hunger as a form of sacrifice, an unavoidable and necessary mode of victimhood that must be endured, perhaps even embraced by Marind in the name of a greater good. Now, this etiology syncretizes concepts of martyrdom and salvation derived in part from Catholicism, which was introduced to the Upper Bian by missionaries in the 1930s, and that is now the primary creed amongst Papuans more generally, and in part from pre-existing millenarian beliefs that have been widely documented across Melanesia. In many of the sermons I attended, for instance, local Catholic priests often describe the prevalence of hunger as a sort of test of villagers' moral fortitude, a reminder of the importance of prayer and faith in overcoming pain and loss, and indeed a condition that, much like the Passion of Christ, is not one to be explained or rationalized, but rather to be accepted as God's wish. For many parishioners who attend these sermons, accepting hunger today comes with the anticipation of an abundance enjoyed either in the afterlife or in a distant future when glory, culture, and wealth will once again be restored to Marind and to Papuan peoples. At the same time, this sacrificial logic of hunger is also widely associated by Marind with the logic of global capitalist modernity. So, for instance, Barnabas's wife, Evelina, often told me that Marind had to go hungry in order to feed the nation and the world, a slogan that was invoked by both Presidents Yudhoyono and Jokowi in promoting the national food security objectives of the MIFE mega project. All palm, Evelina continued, is a global commodity that serves both as a food ingredient and a source of renewable energy. It is used in all manner of goods, from instant noodles and shampoo to toothpaste and biofuels. With the world's population rapidly growing, demand for this cheap and versatile product also continues to grow. Evelina concluded, hunger for us Marind means pain and suffering, but our hunger also helps to feed the world. Perhaps there is meaning and value in this burden. Rather than a simple internalization of state and corporate rhetoric, one can read in the words of Evelina and others an acutely incisive commentary on the logic of world capitalist regimes. These words point to recognition on the part of Marind of their own positioning within asymmetric distributions of power, wealth, and resources across local and global scales. These words speak to an indigenous realpolitik of capitalist modernity, one starkly articulated by those whose bodies must pay the price for progress. It is here that the sacrificial logic of capitalist modernity differs from the sacrificial logic of religious and millenarian epistemologies. Whereas the latter comes with the promise of future redemption and freedom for those sacrificed today, the latter dictates that certain populations, in this case Marind, must remain oppressed and deprived so that other populations can be nourished and thrive. As Evelina put it, some must go hungry in order for others to be fed. In these entrenched and asymmetric relations binding consumer and consumed under capitalist regime, The hunger suffered by one party is a necessary precondition for achieving the other satiety. Hunger then can be both understood as a stance of selfless altruism, a sort of willing giving up of one's needs to satisfy the other, and as a fundamental attribute of capitalism itself, a force characterized by its relentless appetite for and pursuit of land, resources, profit, and power. Divergent in their scales and subjects, the etiologies of hunger that I've outlined are in turn the object of widespread contention amongst Marind, both in terms of their relative explanatory potential and in terms of their implications for action and remedy. Young Marind, for instance, often challenged elders' invocation of ancestral punishment by pointing out that hunger is the consequence of political and economic factors way beyond their control and not the result of individualist or intentional Marind choices and decisions. Marind involved in land and human rights activism, meanwhile, accused those who conceptualize hunger as a necessary and altruistic form of sacrifice of undermining grassroots resistance to agribusiness expansion. To accept hunger and suffering as inevitable, young activist Geronimo affirmed, is to give up on the struggle for dignity, well-being, and freedom to the detriment of both Marind today and to come. But perhaps most debated of all is the ambivalent association made by many Marind between hunger and capitalist modernity. And I think the words of Barnabas really powerfully captured this ambivalence. Barnabas reflected, hunger and capitalist modernity, they are complicated things. Capitalist modernity causes hunger for little people like us in order to feed big people like the government and corporations and foreign countries. In some ways, modern people and capitalist people do not know what hunger is anymore because they possess everything they need and more. But modern people and capitalist people are never satiated. They eat everything, but they are always hungry for more: land, money, workers, wealth. Perhaps then becoming hungry means becoming modern? To conclude, in this paper I've examined the new and different forms of hunger afflicting Marind and their more than human environment on the West Papua and all palm frontier. I demonstrated how hungers and the food choices that accompany them accrue symbolic potency from what they reveal about the identity, relations, and morality of both the consumer and the consumed. The subjects and objects of these hunger encompass an array of consequential entities, humans both hungry and hungered after, but also hegemonic institutions, material infrastructures, and even introduced plants. Alternately destructive or generative, hungers in the Marind life world accrue further significance in light of their multiple and contested etiologies. Cross-cutting spiritual, cosmological, and political realms, these explanatory models both illuminate and trouble the relationship between hunger as a form of imposed structural violence and hunger as a product of unevenly distributed responsibility, agency, and intentionality. In particular, these hungers invite us to consider hunger more broadly and attendant modes of asymmetric production and consumption, not only as an effect of global capitalist regimes, but perhaps as capitalism's very form or ontology. The insights I've presented, I think, highlight the importance of attending to the situated cultural and political history of hunger in tandem to its bodily and material manifestations. As historian James Vernon writes, this history matters not just because hunger hurts, but because how it has hurt has always been culturally and historically specific. We need to take seriously the very slipperiness of hunger as a category and bear witness to its changing forms and meanings. In this paper, I think I've sought to grapple with the slipperiness of hunger in a place increasingly becoming, in anthropologist Nancy Shepherd Hughes' words, a land of many kinds of hungers. In this out-of-the-way place, the waning of forest ecologies gives rise to complex ecologies of hunger that operate across multiple scales, substances, and species. These emergent ecologies of hunger draw attention to the more than human dimensions of food and hunger, as these arise from interspecies relations of eating and being eaten, and feeding and being fed. At once material, moral, affective, and symbolic, ecologies of hunger highlight how nourishment is shaped not just by food access and availability, but also by the particular kinds of food in question and the societal and ecological value. For instance, who produces them, where they come from, who consumes them, and at whose cost. Emergent ecologies of hunger in Merauke also generate a condition of aporia, or irresolvable internal contradiction between competing forms of hunger that are not all always bad and that cannot all be equally satiated. These hungers problematize the possibility of indigenous food sovereignty in settler colonized places like West Papua, whose infrastructures of power are built on the theft of bodies, lands, and political freedoms. And they highlight the malleable and changing meanings of hunger itself amongst food insecure peoples in the face of modernization agendas, capitalist incursions, and attendant social environmental transformations. Expressive of inherent tensions between local realities and global forces, emergent ecologies of hunger shape in contested yet creative ways the more than human gastropolitics of the Marind life world, one for whose protagonists the matter at stake in everyday food decisions is just as much what to eat or not eat as it is to eat or be eaten. Thank you.
Thank you. That was terrific. Thanks very much. Wonderful talk. Thank you. Ida, I'll let you go ahead and moderate.
Yes, thank you so much, Sophie. That was absolutely so inspiring and fantastic, really outstanding presentation. We now invite questions, and we have quite a few here already. We have a question from Professor Al McCoy, and I'm not sure he wants to read it himself, or I can go ahead and read it.
Could you read it? Just give me a second to sort of
I can read
shift into Q&A mode.
So this Indonesian land grab in Papua, with all the deleterious ramifications of the indigenous you have so carefully described, seem to be part of what Roseanne Rudden at the University of Amsterdam called the global land grab. As notions such as the UAE, South Korea, and others engage in massive land leasing, Papua and Papua New Guinea seem ideal terrains for such legalized expropriation. Have you seen multinational schemes manifest in Papua? Is such expropriation now take a significant percentage of Papua's total forest? And he thanks you very much for this stimulating presentation.
Thank you for that question. Yes, absolutely. These large-scale land acquisitions, the politically correct term for land grab, are very much the broader sort of context in which these landscape transformations are happening. Oil palm was introduced in 2008, so spot on at the food, fuel, and finance crisis when we were seeing these this spate of large-scale land acquisitions across the global south. And indeed, many of the companies, many of these subsidiaries operating in Merauke are part of larger multinational conglomerates, particularly South Korean ones, but also Singaporean and Malaysian corporations, that are entering into land deals primarily with the Indonesian government. At the same time, it can be really, really tricky to trace these sorts of corporate kinships. The identities of many of these corporations on the ground is quite elusive. It can be very tricky to trace particular plantations to larger corporations. The data on that is difficult to obtain, particularly in the context of West Papua, all the more so. But there certainly are links to border corporations and investors as well. So, the World Bank, the international finance corporations fund many of these projects. And also many of the corporations, these multinational corporations, are members of the sustainability schemes like the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. In terms of percentage, I wouldn't be able to give you a figure. It's very hard to get a figure that the scale of these projects is constantly shifting and wildly shifting. I quoted the figure of 1.7 million hectares. That's sort of the area of land targeted for conversion. Some of it has been raised, some of it not yet, but the figures vary widely according to government sources, even within the government itself. But there's definitely a very big foreign corporate presence in the region.
And I think Professor Al McCoy has a follow-up. Will the forest disappear from Papua by 2030 or 2040?
I wouldn't be able to tell you, Alfred, in terms of actual statistics. I mean, the pace at which this deforestation is happening is really unprecedented. COVID-19 2020 has seen that pace only accelerate as attention has been deflected to other concerns and crises, and in the meantime, corporations have been very, very quick to sign further land agreements and so forth. So, whether the forest will entirely disappear, I think is a question that has to be considered in another related context that I didn't talk about today, which is conservation projects in West Papua. And I brought this up in my presentation on the plantation scene with Ida a couple of days ago, which is this phenomenon where a lot of oil palm corporations that are part of sustainable palm oil schemes are now trying to offset the deforestation to make way for oil palm by setting aside buffer zones or high conservation value zones. Now, these are, of course, often small area, patches or fragments of forests that often Marind themselves are equally excluded from because they are conservation sites. So forest may still be standing by 2030 or 40. I think the question for Marind is, will it be their forest, and will they still have the right to travel to these forests and subsist from these forests and sustain the sort of interspecies relations with those forests that make those forests meaningful to them beyond purely sort of biodiversity concerns and prerogatives.
Thank you for that. We're going to have a question afterwards that I think we'll kind of like circle back to what you mentioned right now about the conservation projects. You might be able to expand on that. But now we have a question from Billy, and I will read it out. It's a bit long, but it's very insightful. The discourse of hunger and craving here reminds me of similar discourses of craving as thirst in several mainland Southeast Asian languages, such as Khmer, Vietnamese, Ragle, and Cham. Two of those are probably influenced by thirst as craving from Buddhist contexts, and thus we'd expect to find them in all spaces, Theravada and Mahayana in Southeast Asia, while the other two are, at least self-described, influenced by the necessity scarcity of potable water resources. Is there a similar discourse of thirst in marine contexts, or is discourse of thirst simply replaced by metaphorical hunger in all linguistic contexts you took note of? And perhaps related, I recall reading several years back that something like 60% of the population of Papua doesn't have access to safe drinking water. Is there a distinction between New Guinea and West Papua in terms of access? How is access tied to increasing consumption of plastics and the potential of privatization of water by capitalist structures?
Thank you for that question, Billy, and thank you for directing me to these really interesting comparative examples of thirst as a form of craving. I'll definitely look into that. So in Merauke, among Marind, it's interesting. Hunger does indeed, as you point out, tend to be the prevalent sort of, term or idiom through which Marind communicate these relationships of consumption, production, eating and being eaten. Although I should say, and I didn't touch on this, but there is a veritable grammar of hunger. So we have, in English, we have one word for hunger, craving, perhaps another. In the Marind language, there is the word for hunger itself differs depending on what you're hungry for and who you are as the one who is hungry. So this is literally a grammar of hunger. So the term for the term for hunger for the flesh of a cassowary is different to the term for the hunger for the flesh of a wild boar. And again, the term will be inflected depending on whether the speaker is themselves from a clan that is affiliated or shares a kinship with the animal consumed, the cassowary or the boar. So there are multiple idioms of grammar within that category of hunger more broadly. Thirst is limited. Thirst is actually often associated with alcohol consumption, actually. So it's often it's deployed in a morally negative sort of context. It's linked to very serious problems of alcoholism in the area that I was working in, but also more generally in West Papua. Strong home-brewed liquor, but also rice wine that's illegally traded by military forces and also by kiosk owners and so forth. And that has become a source of huge concern, particularly for women in the villages and for children. And that's one of the main ways that the money is wasted is on alcohol by men who are entering into these contracts and land surrender agreements and holding on to the cash. So that's the only context in which thirst arises. And water pollution, yes. I mean, it's I pointed at the beginning my wariness of idealizing or romanticizing the traditional Marind dialect. There's a huge amount of literature out there on, the nutritional problems with sago-based diets and so forth. But certainly, what was apparent from Marind's discourses was that the arrival of oil palm has led to unprecedented water pollution in the area, from chemical fertilizers, pesticides, rodenticides, and so forth, but also mill effluents. Toxic mill effluents that are often released directly into the rivers from the refineries and the mills, because it's just a cheaper way to dispose of it. So water pollution is linked in turn to a rise in food poisoning, dysentery, particularly amongst children and infants, but also the killing of riverine and aquatic creatures. People talk about and I saw this, the fish and crocodiles becoming, they say, drunk on chemicals and then rising to the surface by the dozens, by the hundreds. And of course, there is also the privatization of water, in the sense that many riverways have been diverted by the corporations to irrigate the plantations. So the very sort of topology of the landscape is shifting in the production of these capitalist natures as well.
Thank you for this. Our next question is from my beloved advisor, Catherine, whether there are any forms of existence in West Papua.
Thank you for the question, Catherine. Yes, there's, so I came to this, a little bit of context might be useful here. I came to this doctoral research and now postdoctoral research from an NGO background myself. I worked for the Forest Peoples Programme, which is an international Indigenous rights organization that partners with Indigenous coalitions to seek to secure their rights to lands and livelihoods. And that was what brought me to West Papua in the first instance. And so there are an array of international and also local and regional Indonesian and Papuan NGOs that are working closely with Marind in the Upper Beyond to submit complaints, reports, and entertain advocacy and negotiations with the government and also with oil palm corporations. And this advocacy takes place at multiple different levels. So there are grassroots forms of resistance in the form of protests, blockades in the plantations. Some Marind have resorted to poisoning the oil palm trees illegally as well. Then there's also resistance in the form of communities working with NGOs to put together complaints of land rights and human rights violations to sustainable palm oil schemes. So the RSPO and the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, the one I mentioned earlier, has been a clear platform, a key platform, a non-governmental platform for communities to bring their cases and complaints to a multi-stakeholder table and seek to have these recognized and redressed under voluntary corporate principles and criteria of sustainable palm oil production with mixed results. And then the third form of resistance or advocacy, I would say, would be at the sort of UN level. This was also something I was involved with. So this was primarily in the form of urgent missives and cases submitted to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. We submitted 3 of these complaints in 2011, 2012, and 2013, all of them pertaining to human and land rights violations. And also many of the cases have been brought to the attention of the special rapporteurs, both Jim Anaya, the former rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples, and Olivier de Schutter, former special rapporteur on the right to food. As I said, the broader political context of West Papua has made it very, very difficult to conduct these forms of resistance on the ground. It's a part of Indonesia, as I'm sure you know, that's very difficult for foreign entities to enter. But also one of the biggest problems that Marind have faced in struggling for recognition of their land rights is that as soon as they start to invoke the discourse of rights or hak, they immediately render themselves vulnerable to accusations of independent aspirations, right? The right to self-determination becomes a convenient sort of way of repackaging what for many Marind is simply the right to feed themselves and feed their children and survive in many ways. It's a very precarious situation. So the political context has made it difficult for any sort of rights-based resistance or movement to not conveniently be elided or criminalized, for that matter, in the guise of self-determination or independentist aspirations.
Thank you for this. Catherine, do you have any follow-up? No? Okay, good. I have a quick question, actually. It's somehow related to this. I'm interested to know if there are any hopes of satiation of any kind. And I think this is more like related to environmental justice, which you also look at very extensively. But are these any culturally contingent modes of satiation that emerge, like dreams of hopes and so on and so forth? And also, in relation to this, I'm wondering if there's any relationship between the hunger for plastics with inter-ethnic kinship, like the idea of making, you know, and united Indonesian nations with transmigrants just by virtue of eating the same or behaving in the same way or going to the city or just adopting this more modern lifestyle.
Thank you, Ida. Yeah, no, satiation is a great place to start thinking about hunger, you know, and it brings into the picture all kinds of interesting and difficult questions, I think, about, you know, hope more generally, right? And I think you know, what I would respond to that is that, and as I hope I tried to convey, that it's a very, you know, communities are very fractured and internally contesting and disagreeing over what satiation in a plantationist scenic era feels like, tastes like, looks like, and what it does to bodies, places, and persons today, right? So there is no, you know, in some ways you could say the situation has become complexified, right? In the past there was this hunger for forest foods, and now there's all kinds of new and different hungers, and each of them calls for a different object of satiation. So there's anything but agreement on that. So the kind of gastropolitical landscape, if you wish, is incredibly fragmented on the ground. I think when it comes to satiation, what really comes clear, and this is where perhaps we're talking less about, you know, indigenous food sovereignty than a sort of a multi-species justice sort of terrain, is that, you know, Marind are adamant that food justice for humans also in turn depends on some sort of food justice for other than human beings, right? The native plants and animals with whom they share these ecosystems. So perhaps a form of multi-species justice, one that recognizes non-human beings both as food but also as fed, as subjects of nourishment, and one that in turn, you know, as Marind themselves put it, positions humans also as ones who don't just feed but who are there to become good food for others. I think that's a really powerful statement, and, you know, invites some really interesting questions about what it means to eat well and be eaten well in a more than human world. So satiation will always be an interspecies relation in the same way that hunger is also, you know, a trans-species sort of dynamic. In terms of transmigration, that's a really, really good question. And I always feel like I don't do justice to that side of the story. And in part, it's very difficult because, you know, my fieldwork was very much focused on working with and thinking with Marind. And I had very little access actually to the perspectives of transmigrants, because there is so much tension and conflict between Papuan Marinds and non-Papuan settlers who, you know, also are very much, you know, there's been an unprecedented influx of migrants into the region. Merauke is now 60% non-Papuan settlers and only 40% Indigenous Marind settlers. Papuans, you know, are differ in terms of their religions. They differ in terms of many of their cultural practices, their gastropolitical practices as well, and they tend to live quite separate lives, actually. So even in the village, you know, there is the transmigrant sort of end of the village, and then there's the Marind sort of end of the village, with each with their respective churches and mosques. A lot of Marind feel looked down upon by non-Papuans for the color of their skin, for their forest-based way of life. And that comes across a lot in everyday life. Racism is a big part of this story as well. So in that light, and there's been very little by way of intermarriage between transmigrants and Marind, certainly where I was working. In the cities, it's a very, very different sort of landscape. So in Merauke, for instance, there is a category of people called Jamer or Jawa Merauke, who are precisely that, you know, people who have intermarried and their progenies. So in that sense, I think that the possibility of kinship through plastic with plastic people and through plastic foods is not something that was part of the landscape that I was exploring. But if there is a piece I published a couple of years ago called The Plastic Cassowary, it's an ethnos, and it's looking at plastic in the context of animals, actually, plastic animals these creatures who are losing their forest and now approaching Marind settlements in search of shelter and subsistence, and who are also described as plastic because they are behaving like settlers and like humans in this very sort of uncanny, troubling sort of way. So that would be a piece I'd invite you to visit for more. And that one explores a lot the sort of plasticity also of animals and their indexicality with non-Papuan settlers.
Thank you for this. Yeah, it's very complex indeed. It's complex and so much to cover, and it's very fastly changing. It's a landscape that changes very fast all the time. We have two more questions. One from, again, Professor Al McCoy. When will this work be available either in journal articles or in a book form?
Well, thank you. That's a very encouraging question, Alfred. So this is actually this project on hunger specifically is one that I'm currently writing my second monograph on. The reason for that has a lot to do with the woman that I worked with in the field who had a lot of reservations about putting this particular material out there. And there's a whole gendered dynamic to the story that I didn't get much of a chance to touch on, although I did mention it in the context of prostitution and sexual violence and the, some real anger towards Marind men amongst the women for what they're doing and the way they're behaving, in terms of ceding lands and so on. So the time is right now, and it wasn't before. And so I'm preparing a monograph and also a couple of articles currently under review with medical anthropology, and food society and culture. So hopefully soon. But there is a big food and satiation element to the first book that Ida mentioned, the one that's under contract with Duke, In the Shadow of the Palms, particularly looking at sort of the construction of sago people and becoming human through and with sago in the grove. So hopefully that'll be a teaser to the monograph to follow.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Well, I also added your the link to your digital platform, Modern Human Worlds, where you have a very expansive and comprehensive repository of all your work. So I highly encourage people to take a look at it if they want to have more details. And we have a final question from Larry. Have any Marind risen to positions in the government? So I'd like to cover representation more broadly.
Yeah, thank you, Larry. Yeah, so there definitely are Marind in local and provincial levels of government. So local in the sense that every village, every kampong has a village head, a kepala kampong, and most of those village heads are Marind. And there are also Marind who are working at the the district level of Merauke, the district government, and also in Jayapura, the capital of Papua province, the eastern half of what we know as Papua. So it's really interesting because the Marind are a broad sort of category that encompasses 5 or 6 different sub-Marind groups. The Marind I was working with were the upper Bian Marind, there are also the lower Bian Marind, the swamp Marind, the Kimam Marind, and most of the Marind who have risen to positions in government are not actually from where I work. They're more sort of from the urban areas around Merauke city and towards the west Kimam Island. And when it comes to the village heads, the Kepala Kampong, they are all Marind, but they have very little, the villagers do not recognize them as legitimate representatives or spokespersons for village interests, right? And there's a lot of, and in fact, these village heads that I talk to, they are acutely aware that no one takes them seriously, and they're very much sort of seen as sort of pawns of the government, and it's not a particularly comfortable position for them to be in, although there's a lot of corruption also going on at that sort of level. So they're in this sort of strange interstitial space, losing their legitimacy as villagers and community members, but also operating and afforded heightened decision-making power as members of the official state infrastructure.
Thank you very much for this. And I think it is perhaps time to conclude. So thank you so much, Sophie, for this amazing analysis of the morally laden, culturally and phenomenologically contingent meanings of hunger in West Papua, and how hunger can be used as a hermeneutical device for understanding capitalist modernity. I think that's absolutely, it's such a great takeaway. We'll be looking forward to your work, and thank you so much for joining us at such an early time on a Saturday morning from Sydney.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Ida, and thanks to all of you for your incredibly thought-provoking questions and generosity of knowledge and self.